Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched. I'm your host, the Social Solipsist, and this week I watched El Mariachi from 1992. Now, this is a movie that I only ever hear of every once in a while, and usually only in very specific circles. And that's usually people who think about and talk about cinema as a lot as a form of art and as multinational economic thing. This is a really interesting movie that I basically didn't know anything about going into it. And in fact, I had forgotten that this is a Robert Rodriguez film. And in fact, basically his first commercial film. I would hesitate to call it commercial, but we'll get into some of the details there. This is a fascinating film and not exactly what I expected. I chose it in part because it was on my list and because I had been thinking more about this sort of ongoing arc I have, talking about westerns and noir and thinking about how different genres of film are attached to each other and how various films or periods of filmmaking either start to retire certain elements or evolve certain aspects of particular genres, how they blur genres, how they take inspiration from other things that are popular at the time to revitalize or adapt genres to more modern audiences, etc., etc. And while I was very curious what this looked like, as far as being a potential sort of Western influenced thing, it actually got me thinking about that in a much more roundabout and a much more complicated way than I expected to. Now, this sort of falls into a genre of film that doesn't really exist in the US, but is or was fairly common in Mexican cinema in particular, and sort of Central and South American cinema. And I think the term that's commonly used for this is the narcotraficante movie. It's basically a movie about drug smuggling, drug lords, those sorts of things. It's something that's obviously a lot more pervasive and visible outside the US, and it's outside of Hollywood, and something that usually only gets brought up, a topic that really only gets brought up in Hollywood most often for the kinds of things that are sort of oorah or the US kinds of things. Even things that I think are very good, like Sicario, which I watched some time ago and talked about, which sort of falls into that, doesn't really end up in the same, it's not really in the same genre space, even though it uses some of the same elements to it and same sort of plot beats, but in very different ways. But what was really interesting to me going through this further is that this is much more influenced by the VHS, largely direct-to-VHS, low-budget action films that came out of starting really in the 70s, but primarily in the 80s. And the sheer number of those films that were produced on relatively small budgets all throughout that period and clogged up video stores and all sorts of things thereafter because of, as I think I've talked about this before, I don't remember in the context, but this rise of access to home video production. However, the influence should not put you off this, because absolutely there's a lot of stuff from that era that is extremely bad. The vast majority of it is. However, the influences, I think, are turned around and used to really interesting effect in this film. Not because it necessarily had the deliberate was making a deliberate effort, or didn't seem to be making a deliberate effort to like be better than those things or to even upend any of the tropes or typicalities of that. But there's some flavor elements that just sort of point in that direction. I'll get a little into that later, but I'm going to go back initially to talking about the film itself, because this is basically Robert Rodriguez's first feature-length film, I believe. It's the production behind it is fascinating, worth going and reading the Wikipedia article and some other stuff about it if you're curious. But apparently the production behind this film was basically Robert Rodriguez as like a 20-something was selling himself to pharma companies to do drug testing, making his money that way. Raised $9,000 and said, I'm going to go make a movie, because he had some, shorter other things that he had made before that had really gotten him into filmmaking. But he only had $9,000, and he basically said, okay, what can I do? I can go down with some people I know down to Mexico and hire people off the street and make a movie on an absolute shoestring budget with no real gear, and we'll see what we get. And it's basically what amounts to a student film, although with less of student, not in the sense of being an actual film student. But that does not mean anything. There's student films are often very, very bad. What's fascinating even more so is that he raised $9,000 doing drug testing and then only spent apparently $7,225 making this film. And what he ultimately turned out is shockingly impressive. It's shocking that he was able to make anything for that kind of money. And he shot it in like 2 weeks in this town, like sort of south of Texas, with the lead actor who he knew. It's the lead actor's hometown, and they just made a film. And it is rough. Like, don't get me wrong. It looks like a cheap student film, but not nearly as much as it should. I've seen films that were budgeted for $100,000 or a few $100,000 that look worse than this. And if you really want to stare at it and try and pick apart all the things that are weird or rough or bad about it, then absolutely you can find things all over the place should have been done better. But that for me at least was with the thinking of, oh, this is an inexpensive film. It's not a $7,000 film. You can't make anything for $7,000. That's insane. And so this became this whole saga apparently for him, because this is where he really got his start as now an extremely successful, extremely famous filmmaker. It was basically being incredibly smart about how he spent his money, about not spending any money when he could, repurposing everything, doing everything the cheapest way possible, just being incredibly inventive to ensure that nothing cost anything if they could avoid it, and if it costs anything, it costs as little as possible. So the story behind that is fascinating. By all accounts, the acting and the casting is not great, but it's not terrible, especially when you consider that almost everybody in the production is not a professional actor. Most of them, I think, had no prior acting experience. They were basically just given lines to say, and in some cases didn't even know Spanish. I think at least one of the characters didn't, or one of the actors didn't know Spanish that they brought with them, and it was just reading lines. But by all accounts, to my ear, does a pretty good. It's affected, but it's a pretty good pronunciation. He's not butchering anything. So well done there. Meanwhile, almost everybody else on the production that isn't like one of three people was just somebody off the street who also ended up doubling as the crew whenever they weren't in a shot. They were holding lights or, whatever, because that's just what they had to do to make it work. And it's really, really impressive because what ends up turning out is a pretty good film. Now, part of the reason I say that you could pick this apart but you won't is because after the initial couple of minutes, at least for me, like the surprise of its rough edges wears off very quickly, and it's ultimately very engaging. And that is in no small part down to good editing, good pacing, a decent script, a script that is simple and doesn't go beyond its means. It knows exactly what it's making. It's doing exactly what it wants to. It doesn't meander. It's got its story locked down, and it knows what it's going to deliver. It's incredibly focused. It's really very well paced under the circumstances. The tone is very clear. It integrates elements of several different genres, and has a little bit of different kind of flavors for different kind of movie-going audiences, and ultimately comes down into something that is something where you go, yeah, this could have cost $1 million and it wouldn't surprise me. At least certainly for what I've seen made for $1 million, this could have been much more expensive. It's shocking that they made anything, let alone that they made something pretty darn good. And so good, in fact, that apparently Rodriguez was originally intending for this to go be a straight to VHS or a straight to TV thing, and he shopped it around for like Mexican TV stations, and nobody wanted to take it, so he ended up sending it to some people in Hollywood, and they ended up picking it up and like funding for it to get like cleaned up, the production to get cleaned up, and produced into a proper release. It's a testament to what you can do if you have some smarts, some inventiveness, a willingness to cut all the corners where you need to and be smart about that, and a clear vision for what you want to do. I will say that pretty much every core element of it, I could say something negative about if I really wanted to. The music is a little rough but serviceable. The cinematography is a little rough but very serviceable. In fact, it is sort of points at some of the stylistic elements that would become some of Rodriguez's hallmarks later in his career. The dialogue and the script, like, it's very simple. It's sometimes very cliche. It strays into some of the tropes that are very common in those bad 80s action films, but is never like boring or dull or too offensive or anything else. It's very well put together. The acting, again, it's shockingly good performances from people who largely didn't know how to act, and even fight choreography that points at some of the cheesiness of those 80s action films, but is so inherently well produced that it doesn't really bother you. Speaking of, in particular, a particular note for production, the $7,000 movie does slow motion correctly. You guys have heard me complain about before how multi-million-dollar Hollywood movies have this problem where for some reason they shoot slow motion wrong, where they shoot it at 24 frames a second and then they slow it down, and then it's at even lower frame rate because that's how frames work. This movie actually shot on 16 millimeter film, with who knows what camera, actually shoots the slow-mo correctly, where you speed up the film so that when you slow it down, it's at the right frame rate. How is this film made by a nobody 20-year-old getting that right when multi-million dollar Hollywood films are not? Like, just props for noting that one thing. This is clearly somebody who gives a shit and thinks about what they're producing and knows what they have to do. And I actually don't know what his, what if any formal education he had in cinema before this, but like, clearly in one way or another, he had the knowledge to operate the camera, and has these stylistic beats where he's clearly informed about what cinema looks like, but also is bringing his own flavor to it in his cinematography. Just so many smart things going on there. There are a bunch of little things that, for every little thing I could say this is cheap or rough or whatever, there's things that are really, really strong. Now, when it starts to, I start thinking about some of those genre elements that I've been talking about in previous episodes, that's where I'm still thinking about this movie, and will probably keep thinking about it, because it has started me in yet another branch in this sort of tree of thinking about the both the chronology of cinema and the sort of crossovers between various genres. Now, especially with this being Robert Rodriguez, frequent collaborator with Quentin Tarantino as well, they are both really big fans of a couple of different genres that are maybe not as popular, especially things like noir. Obviously, Pulp Fiction is noir-esque in some of its elements. A bunch of their other collaborations have had noir elements. Sin City, which I believe is a Robert Rodriguez production with Quentin Tarantino as a producer. Anyway, they both dip into noir. They dip into a bunch of different genres, and especially the quote-unquote genre films, as in the terminology used for like genre fiction, horror and sci-fi, and those sorts of things are all things that are elements that they loop back in to other flavors of movies that they make. Again, with some of the visual elements and the tropes that are used in this film, it really strongly got me thinking a little bit about noir, but even more so about 80s action films. And that got me thinking even more about sort of this history from the Western. Because as I talked about in previous episodes, we have sort of this line. It's not a straight line by any means, but between sort of very early cinema, early, like some of the very first films ever made are Western flavored, or first movies made in the US are Western flavored. I'm trying to remember what the name of that like 1 minute film or whatever, 3-minute film is that has like, it's that iconic picture of the cowboy with the big hat. Anyway, going we don't need to go all the way back that far, but it's just things I think about. So we have this in particular writing and storyline through line of the narrative of good and evil, of the cowboy for justice and goodness versus bandits or evildoers of some kind. This is a narrative that goes through various sort of iterations. It has evolutions over the course of just the Western in the US. It branches off into things like the spaghetti Western. In some sense, it also branches off into the Narcos genres that I was talking about before, where it may not be a direct influence per se, but there is a very clear parallel between the idea of, an underdog who is fighting against criminal organizations who want to commit violence, who don't care about regular civilians, who are willing to, do all sort of dastardly things. So that there's that sort of through line to that genre, but there's also this main through line through to action films. Primarily, that's a transition that happens in the 70s. This was something I hadn't really considered before, but something I started thinking about, especially after previous weeks where I was talking about how Westerns sort of died out in the 70s. I didn't really think about what ended up replacing them. And the answer, at least in my mind, is that this is the transition towards a different sort of sociocultural era that is largely defined by the Cold War. That is the source of a lot of action films that would come out in the 70s and 80s and into the 90s that are ultimately a similar flavor of nationalistic propaganda as the Western was, where the Western was initially a taming of the West, this narrative about manifest destiny and the goodness of justice and the American way, etc., etc. It transitioned to being a little bit more dirty, a little bit more gray, and then and in the sort of post-war era, and then as we went through sort of these historical events, in particular the several wars that happened throughout the 50s, 60s, and 70s, Korea, Vietnam, and then other proxy wars and proxy conflicts for the Cold War. That was really a pickup of a new narrative and a new sort of strain of propaganda of rather than needing a taming of our country, it was a narrative about the defense of the U.S., the defense of the American way, and defense against whatever. Whether you want to say it's the USSR or communism or totalitarianism or whatever, those were the narratives that started to arise, and that is what strongly influenced the boom in the 80s of these extremely cheesy, extremely over the top, poorly produced, low budget, direct to VHS action movies with these ridiculous heroes who had gone through this cultural arc of being settlers to sheriffs to various soldiers and things in the era where the war movies were more popular, to these larger than life, over the top, greased up, muscly like Cold War heroes, and those narratives then got cheesier and cheesier and more ridiculous until you got these just incredibly stupid movies that were being made in the 80s. And as bad as so many of those were, they were so pervasive that so many people ended up seeing them. And the people who would come up in then the 90s and even the 2000s and beyond would come into the industry having seen those things, and whether they intended to or not, ultimately would take some artistic beats, artistic ideas from those things. None of that is inherently bad, and I think that's what makes this film so fascinating, is because it takes some of the elements, some of the plot beats, some of the caricatures and tropes from those eras, readapts them back into a genre that is not American, that is distinctly south of the American border, but also retains a bunch of structural elements from those action films, and also a cinematography that we now know is sort of iconic for Rodriguez and other people who would end up following his footsteps. It's really interesting to be able to see the influence of, that's a really stupid shot from a movie in the 80s that is reinterpreted and choreographed and framed better in a movie in the 90s that then influences the movies that person would make in the 2000s and beyond, and evolve further and further. And so you have this, it's always an ebb and flow of styles and influences, and who sees what they're influenced by, and who they end up influencing in turn. So while I wouldn't call this a Western, I wouldn't call it a noir, I wouldn't even necessarily call it an action film, although that's kind of primarily what it is. This takes so many different influences, takes so many different sort of thoughts, and turns them back around and uses them to very good effect, and in such an impressive way, not only because it shirks so many of the bad things that are attached to where it comes from, those crappy movies of the 80s, but turns them into something that would go on into the future, into something even more impressive than this. And this is already so impressive. Is this a great film? No. But I think by all accounts, what it is and what it tells us about a certain cinematic era, a certain place in time, and a certain director, that's what's really, really interesting about this movie to me. I know I've sort of rambled about it in a circle, and I don't know how much I've overly influenced what you may think about it, but I find this thing fascinating. I think it's absolutely worth watching. It's not going to waste your time. It's not going to bore you. It's a hell of a lot better than, almost anything that came out of those VHSs in the 80s. And it's not like an amazing production, but it's very good. Anyway, I think I'm going to cut myself off before I just go ramble out about some other small nicety of this. But thank you guys for watching another episode of Solipsist Watched. I've been your host, the Social Solipsist, and I'll see you guys next time.